Hello and welcome to another Reaper blog video. This is what's new in Reaper 7.08. At first glance, this update changelog doesn't seem like it has a lot, but there are some notable things that I think are worth talking about in a video. Let's do it. We're going to start off this one with the project bay. Add selection mirroring and auto scroll support for effects and effects parameter tabs. Allow disabling grouping of similar media items. Show containers and effects in containers in effects view. Support expanding collapsing groups via left-right keys. And so we find the project bay by going to the view menu, project media effects bay. If you've never seen this before, this is a quick way of seeing all the things in your project in sort of a list view. So we could have source media, media items, effects parameters, your groups, your take comps, your automation items, everything in different categories on different pages in a big list. If it's a source media or a media item, we can hit spacebar and preview it. There's lots of things that we can do with this. So if we go over to the media items page, you can see that there's not a whole lot going on in this project. Like, I don't know, 10 files or so. And there's one item in the list for each of those items. If we come over to the options menu in this window and go to group similar objects into single items, that's going to condense this list. So wherever there are items that are basically the same, we'll see something like 6 instances as the track and position. And if we right click, we'll see the list of where these things were used. So I'm pretty sure that the similar objects option was sort of enabled by default previous to this update, and now it is optional and we can choose to have this. If you click on any of these effects here, you can see that in my mixer, it's actually changing which track is selected. So there's selection mirroring even in the effects page, not just on the media items page and the source media page, which is pretty cool. For effects, they've added the ability to put things into containers in version 7, and now within the effects tab of the project bay, we'll be able to see that. So let me just set up a container, let's say, on this poly D track. All right, so all of these are inside of a container. In the effects chain, you just see the container, but inside, there's another effects chain. In the project media bay, we see this as a indented list for all the things inside of the container. Within the item groups page, we can expand and collapse groups. So it's a left arrow key to collapse that group and a right arrow key to expand the group. And by default, they will be expanded. And that's basically it for the project bay changes. Up next is changes to lanes. Actions to move items up, down by lane, respect project auto crossfade setting. Action to move comp area up, down for selected items skips lanes with no media. Add setting on mouse modifier's preference page for media item edits in comping lane to affect media item edge in source lane. Starting with the first one, if we have auto crossfade disabled and we have trim content behind media items when editing turned off, now it will correctly just overlap but not crossfade those items. And if we turn on auto crossfade media items with editing and drag down, this will correctly crossfade. There are some users that do not use trim content behind media items when editing, and they do not want crossfades when dragging items around. They want them to overlap without a crossfade, so it wasn't respecting that auto crossfade function correctly. So let's go into comping mode. So by double clicking on the yellow circle, we're now comping into this top lane. And there's these actions here: fix lane comp area, move comped area up for selected items and down for selected items. And I've got those assigned to Command Shift down and Command Shift up. And the change here is that the empty areas, which you'll see on lane 1 and lane 3, will not be selected for this item. So we go to Command Shift down. And so because there is some content within this selection, that one did get selected, but it will skip lane 3 entirely because it is empty. So I can select another item here, and if I press Command Shift down arrow, this highlighted area will go to here and skip this lane. So I'm going down and down and down, and it's back to the first take. Media item edge edits in comping lane affect media item edges in source lane. Okay, I think I found a way to explain this. So when this option is on and I'm dragging an item edge in the comp lane, it's going to affect this item down here, which is where this comp is pulling its source from. So it's going to affect the source length as I pull this out, right? So both of them move together to some extent. So as I pull it down to the left, that's going to just decrease the comp lane, but the source lane is limited to its maximum length. Let's undo that a few steps. Okay. And then we'll turn this off and hit OK. And now as I drag this out, it goes up to, the comp lane goes to its maximum length and then it stops, right? So the comp lane has extended past the original length and is not affecting the source length in this lane. Went to the maximum length, and if I go beyond that, it sort of disconnects. There's this blue rectangle here, and there is a copy edited media item back to source lane and recomp, and that should match the source lane to the new comp lane. So which one makes more sense to you? That'll be personal preference, just trial and error maybe. I think I'm going to enable that. That seems to make sense to me. If your media on the fixed lanes is shorter than your actual comp area that you want to use, you want to pull more source out of those items and have those source lanes match your comp lane, it makes sense to have this enabled. For metadata, add option to attempt to preserve source file metadata when rendering media items. Preserve metadata when gluing media items if all glued items share the same source file. Preserve source media metadata when applying effects, rendering as new take, etc. And this is good news because it sucks to have to like recreate all of the original metadata just to add something new, just to glue a file and anything like that. It sucks to put in all the effort to write the metadata, or somebody else did, and then you lose it when you make some small change or you render it again. So in the render window, we're just looking for this option here, preserve source media metadata if possible. Where possible, it's going to try to do that. And you'll only see this when the selected media items option is enabled. So if I go to master mix, that's not going to be an option. That should work with the render to file. That should work with glue. That should work with the option to render effects with the render items as a new take option as well. By the way, I didn't do a video about Reaper 707, but there was like one really interesting change that I wanted to highlight here. And it was something that I think I accidentally showed earlier. But in preferences, mouse modifiers, media item edge, limit edits to source media content for unlooped media items. So if you have loop source turned off for your items and you drag out the end of an audio file, it will actually stop at the end of the item. Now with this off, which is kind of the default Reaper 0 to 706, it would just continue. You can extend an item and just fill in with empty data there. So the item extends longer than the source content, but if you want, you can have limit edits to source media content for unlooped media items enabled, and now that snaps back to the very edge and it never goes past the full length of the file. For a lot of people, that was like the expected behavior, and they were very confused why it doesn't do that. Long requested feature. I think it's really cool that they've added that, and I'm probably going to enable that and keep it on. Add option to only normalize files that are too quiet when rendering or batch converting. If we're in the render window, we go to this normalize limit fade button. We can enable normalize. Too loud was added a while ago, and too quiet is the new option. You can't have both of them on. With them both off, it normalizes everything, too loud, too quiet. You can set it to only too loud or only too quiet, and that's it. So this is available in the render to file window. This is also in the batch converter, file batch item converter. And so normalize on, we have the same option here. Peaks building. Add options to change peak building order, disable parallel building, build active takes before building inactive takes. All right, so that must be in the preferences. Generate peak caches on the preferences media page. Prioritize peak building order for multiple files. Longest media first, project order, track order, file name order. Allow building multiple peaks in parallel, which makes it faster, and you can turn that off. And yeah, and it's automatically going to prioritize the files that are in use before the alternate takes and things like that. That should help with project loading and getting things up and running for you a little bit faster. For video, support video processors within effects containers. That's exactly what it sounds like. You can put video processors into effects containers. They will affect your video. There's not a whole lot we can do other than that. There is the wet-dry mix control on the container, but as of right now, that's not really going to have any effect on it. It's not going to automatically convert to opacity or something like that. But this wet-dry control can be modified or used within the code of the video processor. So you can have something look for the wet-dry mix and then scale back the effect amount within the code of the processor. Right now, as far as I know, nothing has been updated to take advantage of that. What I see as the main benefit for putting your video effects into containers is just that it's easier to create a complex chain of effects and save them and insert them all within one thing. I've complained that video processor presets are really more like individual plugins themselves. By having them in a container and then maybe using the Reaper blog macro controller, you could make a controller that links to several plugins within the container and is one place to modify the various parameters across multiple instances. And you can insert that whole thing with one click through the preset section of the container. So one preset loads in, 3 to 20 video processors, parameters are linked and things like that. And it's a lot more complex. Ultimately opens up some more creative possibilities, or maybe it's just fewer clicks. Yeah, we'll see how this gets used in the future. Containers are still pretty new. Just adding in video processor in this version opens up some new possibilities. Hopefully it gets taken advantage of. This next one is a nice quality of life update for the virtual MIDI keyboard. Show arrow key checkbox at smaller widths. So in the virtual MIDI keyboard, basically, you need to have this window open for it to be active, for it to be useful. You're not actually clicking on it most of the time. So to get all the options visible, you had to have it kind of this minimum amount of size, maybe like this big or so. I don't know. If you made it too small, this option here for the arrow keys, change octave channel, this would disappear too quickly. And there's actually there's an example of it on the in the feature request of it disappearing way too soon. Now we can have this really, really small, and all three of those options are still visible, even though the actual keyboard is tiny. So they've made a really nice change here, just making sure that those options are still available. For MIDI, add actions to set selected MIDI items to ignore project tempo. Add action to set MIDI media items to follow project tempo changes, undoing any previous setting to ignore project tempo. All right, so in this project, I have just this breakbeat drum loop that's MIDI, and project is currently set to 160 BPM. If I play it back, it's going to be 160 BPM. Okay, but what if we want this to work in some other tempo? The usual way we would do this is go to source properties, and we would uncheck this ignore project tempo, and we would set the project tempo here. If I hit apply, we'll see that this is now 80 BPM in a 160 BPM project. I'm going to undo that. So it's back to 160, and we're going to use these new actions here. Set MIDI items to follow project tempo, which is the default, by the way. Any MIDI item you record or import is going to follow the project tempo by default. There's three new actions here. Set MIDI items to use current tempo and ignore project tempo changes. Set item time-based to time. Or set MIDI items to use current tempo and ignore project tempo changes. Set items to beats position only. Before we set that, if I change this to 80 beats per minute, the item position stayed the same, but it's now playing back at 80 beats per minute. Slower. Or we could go 180 and it's faster, but it's still staying on bar 5. Okay, so let's use this action here. Set MIDI items to use current tempo and ignore project tempo changes. So I hit run. Now this item is behaving like it's 180, but we can set our project tempo to 120. And this item is still playing back at 180. It's still at bar 5, but it doesn't align to the grid anymore because we told it not to. If we use the metronome, so we can have different things playing in different tempos with MIDI in this way. And it's pretty simple as just clicking this one item. If we want it to revert back to the previous way, just hit this. And now it's back to following the project tempo. There's this other one, set MIDI items to use current tempo and ignore project tempo changes. So let's just set this to 85. So now the project is 85, this item's 85. We're going to set this, mark it as following, as to ignore project tempo changes. We're going to set our project back to 120. And now the minutes and seconds position has stayed the same because this item time base is set to time. So the minutes and seconds position of this item has not moved, but bar 5 is now over here. And so it's definitely not going to sound in time now. Super off. But this is an important action if there's something that you, let's say, played freestyle on a piano and there's no tempo. It sounds right, but it doesn't need to fit the grid. And as you're adjusting the tempo for other things in your project that are on a strict grid, you don't want that performed MIDI item to change in any way. So now you can select all your items, your MIDI items, and run this action. Or if you change your mind, you can run the other action. Set item time base to beat, ignoring current tempo. This is a great addition. This is a great new set of actions for Reaper. And that's where I'm going to end this one. I probably should go back and talk about the stuff in 704, 705, 706, 707 updates. I didn't realize it was that long ago that I haven't made a video on the Reaper features. Oops. But Happy New Year. This is the first video of the year. Hopefully it's been enjoyable. I know that this series is the most popular and most loved content that I make for this channel. If you appreciate it, consider being a YouTube channel member or a patron, or buy one of my courses or t-shirts or something like that. Let me know that you like it. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Support the Reaper blog through Patreon. And visit reaper.blog for more tutorials.